At 4 in the morning on June 23, 1944, Sergeant Fyodor Okhlopkov was standing in a swamp that smelled like a grave left open in the rain. The Pripet Marshes were not really a place where human beings were supposed to live, let alone fight a war. It was a vast, rotting landscape of stagnant water, black mud, and razor-sharp reeds that stretched for hundreds of miles across the border of Belarus and Ukraine. To the planners in Moscow and Berlin, it was just a blue blob on a map, a natural obstacle that armies were supposed to go around. But to the men on the ground, it was a biological nightmare. The water was never deep enough to swim in, but never shallow enough to walk through. It was a waist-deep soup of decaying vegetation that sucked the boots off your feet and chilled your bones until you stopped shivering and just went numb. And then there were the mosquitoes. They didn't just bite, they swarmed in clouds so thick you could inhale them, covering every inch of exposed skin with a layer of itching, burning misery. Fyodor Okhlopkov didn't mind the mosquitoes, and he didn't mind the mud. He was a Yakut from the far north of Siberia, a man who had grown up hunting seals and bears in conditions that would kill a city dweller in an hour. He knew how to slow his heart rate. He knew how to sit so still that the birds would land on his shoulders. He viewed the war not as a clash of ideologies or a strategic contest, but as a very long, very loud hunt. He had already killed hundreds of German soldiers, earning a reputation as a ghost who could vanish into the snow or the dirt. But the Pripet Marshes were different. The problem here wasn't hiding. The problem was that there was nowhere to hide that the Germans couldn't burn. The German army had learned to hate Soviet snipers. In the early days of the war, they had been careless, walking tall and smoking cigarettes, but by 1944, they had adapted. They had formed special hunter teams called Jag Commandos. These weren't standard infantry conscripts who were terrified of the woods. These were elite units, often made up of former foresters and hunters themselves, equipped with dogs, flamethrowers, and automatic weapons. Their job was simple: sanitize the riverbanks. They knew that snipers liked to hide in the thick reeds along the edge of the water, so they stopped searching the reeds. Instead, they just burned them down. They would move along the shore with flamethrowers, sending long tongues of liquid fire into the vegetation, turning the hiding spots into walls of ash. If the fire didn't kill the sniper, the smoke would flush him out into the open, where the machine guns were waiting. Okhlopkov watched from a distance as a column of black smoke rose into the gray sky about 2 miles downriver. The Jag Commandos were coming. They were methodical, brutal, and efficient. They were clearing the banks of the Pripet River mile by mile, pushing the Soviet scout teams back. The Soviet commander, a nervous political officer who had spent more time reading pamphlets than reading terrain, was in a panic. He had received orders to hold a specific sector of the river to monitor German troop movements on the far side. A high-ranking German officer was rumored to be inspecting the front lines by boat, using the river as a highway because the roads were too muddy for cars. The political officer needed eyes on the water, but every time he sent a team into the reeds, they were burned out or shot. The officer ordered the platoon to dig in on a small, dry ridge about 300 yards back from the riverbank. It was the only piece of solid ground in the sector, a small island of dirt rising out of the swamp. It seemed like the perfect defensive position. It had good sightlines, it was dry, and it offered hard cover. The officer gathered the men and pointed to the ridge, explaining that they would set up a machine gun nest there and wait for the Germans to pass. He spoke about duty and the motherland, about holding the line against the fascist invaders. He looked at the map and tapped the ridge, declaring it the key to the sector. To him, it was a fortress. Okhlopkov looked at the ridge and saw a grave. He knew exactly how a hunter thinks, and he knew that the Germans were hunters. When you're sweeping a swamp, you know that the enemy is miserable. You know they are wet and cold. You know that human beings have a natural instinct to seek comfort. They will always gravitate toward the dry ground. They will always go to the one place where they can dig a hole that doesn't fill with water. The German patrol boats wouldn't even have to search the swamp. They would just look at that ridge, see the fresh dirt, and pound it with mortars and heavy machine guns before the Soviet troops even fired a shot. The ridge wasn't a fortress. It was a trap that the geography had built for them. Okhlopkov shook his head. He approached the political officer, his Mosin-Nagant rifle slung over his shoulder, the wood stock worn smooth by years of use. He spoke quietly, his Russian accented with the rhythms of his native Yakut language. He told the officer that the ridge was a death trap. He said the Germans would expect them to be there. He said that if they wanted to kill the German commander, they couldn't be on the dry ground. They had to be in the water. The political officer looked at Okhlopkov with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. He asked what Okhlopkov meant by in the water. Okhlopkov pointed to the middle of the river. The current was slow and sluggish, the surface broken by drifting logs and patches of floating scum. He explained that nobody looks at the water. People look at the banks, they look at the trees, they look at the bushes, but the human eye naturally glides over the water itself because the brain assumes that nothing dangerous can live in the middle of a river without a boat. He proposed a plan that sounded insane to the city-bred soldiers around him. He would not sit on the bank, he would not climb a tree, he would wade out into the river, submerge himself up to his nose, and float there for hours, waiting for the German boat to pass. The mockery was immediate. The soldiers laughed, shaking their heads at the Siberian's madness. The political officer sneered. He asked Okhlopkov if he thought he was a turtle or a fish. He pointed out the temperature of the water, which was barely above freezing despite the summer month. He explained that a man submerged in that water would lose his body heat in an hour. His muscles would cramp, his hands would shake, and he would eventually lose consciousness and drown. He listed the other dangers, the leeches that would latch onto his skin, the water snakes, the sheer physical exhaustion of fighting the current. He called it a suicide mission, a stupid stunt that would rob the platoon of its best sniper. He ordered Okhlopkov to stop talking nonsense and help dig the foxholes on the ridge. Okhlopkov didn't argue. He didn't try to explain the concept of the hunter's trance, the ability to slow the metabolism and ignore pain that his grandfather had taught him. He didn't try to explain that the cold was just a sensation, not a command. He simply turned away. He walked down to the water's edge, ignoring the shouts of the officer. He scanned the debris cluttering the shoreline until he found what he was looking for. It was a piece of waterlogged driftwood, a thick, blackened log that had been floating in the swamp for years. It was covered in moss and slime, ugly and unremarkable. To anyone else, it was garbage. To Okhlopkov, it was a cloak of invisibility. He pulled a heavy knife from his belt and began to work on the log. He didn't hollow it out like a canoe. He just carved a shallow groove along the top, a notch just wide enough to rest the barrel of his rifle. He cut a few smaller notches on the sides to give him a handhold. The other soldiers watched him from the ridge, leaning on their shovels, making jokes. They called him the log. They bet their vodka rations on how long he would last before he came crawling back to the fire, shivering and begging for warmth. They watched as he tied his ammunition pouch around his neck to keep it high and dry. They watched as he smeared mud over his face and hands, covering every inch of skin until he looked like a bog monster. Okhlopkov stepped into the river. The water hit him like a physical blow, a sudden, shocking cold that punched the air out of his lungs. He didn't gasp. He forced his breathing to remain steady. He waded out the bottom, sinking away into soft, treacherous mud. The water rose to his waist, then his chest, then his neck. He could feel the slime coating his uniform, the weight of the water pressing against his ribs. He pushed the driftwood log ahead of him, using it as a float. He moved slowly, deliberately, taking care not to create ripples. A hunter knows that ripples are nature's alarm system. They travel faster than the swimmer and tell the whole world that something large is moving. He reached the middle of the river, where the current was steady but slow. He settled his body into the water, letting his legs drift behind him. He rested his chin on the back of the log. He placed his rifle in the groove he had carved, the scope sitting just an inch above the rotting wood. He pulled some floating reeds and scum over his head and shoulders, breaking up his silhouette. Within minutes, the man was gone. There was only a log, drifting slowly in the eddy, indistinguishable from the 100 other pieces of debris in the swamp. From the ridge, the political officer watched through his binoculars. He saw nothing. He scanned the water, looking for a head, a helmet, a splash. There was only the brown, oily surface of the river. He lowered the glasses and scoffed. He told the men that the Siberian had probably drowned already or had snuck off to the other bank to desert. He told them to focus on their digging. They had a fortress to build. They were confident in their high ground, confident in their machine guns, confident that the manual was right. They didn't realize that they were digging their own graves on that dry ridge. And they didn't realize that the deadliest thing in the Pripet Marshes wasn't the flamethrowers or the mortars. It was the piece of driftwood floating 30 yards offshore, watching the bend in the river with unblinking eyes. The trap was set, but not the one the Germans were expecting. Okhlopkov adjusted his grip on the underwater stock of his rifle and waited. The cold began to bite, but the hunter did not move. To understand why a man would voluntarily submerge himself in a freezing swamp for 12 hours, you have to understand the specific kind of madness that comes from growing up in the Siberian taiga. Fyodor Okhlopkov was not a soldier who had been drafted from a factory or a farm in the warmth of the Ukraine. He was a Yakut, a man from a part of the world where the temperature drops so low that your breath turns to ice before it leaves your lips. In his village, hunting wasn't a sport. It was the only way to eat. He had learned from the time he was a child that nature doesn't care if you are comfortable. The animals he hunted didn't play by rules, and they didn't give second chances. If you moved, you starved. If you made a sound, you starved. This patience was not something he had learned in basic training. It was built into his DNA. He looked at the Pripet Marshes not as a hellhole, but as a puzzle to be solved. The German Jag commandos were the wolves, and he was the trap. But a trap doesn't work if it looks like a trap. It has to look like nothing. The log that Okhlopkov had chosen was a masterpiece of natural camouflage. It was a piece of ancient oak, waterlogged and blackened by decades of rot. It looked like every other piece of debris floating in the stagnant water, useless, heavy, and dead. But Okhlopkov had modified it with the precision of a craftsman. The groove he had carved along the top was deep enough to hide the barrel of his Mosin Nagant rifle, keeping the steel just above the waterline, but below the visual horizon of anyone standing in a boat. He had rubbed mud into the fresh cuts of the wood to hide the white scars of his knife work. He had draped rotting weeds and algae over the scope, leaving only a tiny tunnel of clear air for the lens. To the casual observer, it was just a piece of trash drifting in the current. To Okhlopkov, it was a tank turret made of wood. He eased himself deeper into the water. The cold was instantaneous and brutal. It wasn't the sharp bite of winter air. It was a heavy, crushing pressure that squeezed his chest and stole the heat from his blood. The water in the Pripet Marshes is deceptively cold because it is stagnant. It doesn't move enough to warm up in the sun. It sits there, deep and dark, holding the chill of the earth. Okhlopkov felt the water seep through his wool uniform, soaking his skin, turning his clothes into a heavy, freezing anchor. His body wanted to shiver. It was a natural reflex, the muscles trying to generate heat, but shivering creates ripples. Ripples create movement, and movement draws the eye. Okhlopkov forced his muscles to relax. He used a breathing technique his grandfather had taught him, taking shallow, slow breaths that filled only the top of his lungs. This kept his chest from rising and falling too much, preventing the water around him from pulsing with his breath. He became a stone. He became a part of the river. The hours began to pass. Time in a sniper hide is not measured in minutes, it is measured in pain. The first hour is uncomfortable. The second hour is agony. The third hour is numbness. By the fourth hour, the mind starts to drift. You start to hallucinate. You start to forget where your body ends and the mud begins. Okhlopkov drifted in that space between awake and asleep, his eyes locked on the bend in the river, his body suspended in the freezing slime. He wasn't alone in the water. The swamp was alive. He felt things moving against his legs, fish, water snakes, perhaps leeches looking for warmth. A large water beetle crawled onto his neck, its legs scratching against his skin. He didn't brush it off, he didn't flinch. To flinch was to die. He let the insects crawl. He let the cold seep into his bones. He focused entirely on the patch of river where the Germans would appear. Back on the ridge, the rest of the Soviet platoon was busy digging their own graves. They had followed the political officer's orders to the letter. They had dug intricate foxholes in the dry earth. They had set up a machine gun nest with a clear field of fire. They had camouflaged their positions with branches and nets. To a military inspector, it would have looked like a perfect defensive position, but Okhlopkov knew it was wrong. It was too perfect. It was exactly where a defensive position was supposed to be. It was the only dry ground for miles. It stood out like a lighthouse. The Germans wouldn't have to search for it. They would just assume it was there. The platoon was banking on the idea that they could see the Germans first. They didn't realize that the Germans weren't just looking with their eyes. They were hunting with their instincts, and a hunter always checks the high ground. Around noon, the sound of engines drifted down the river. It was a low, throbbing vibration that carried over the water long before the boats appeared. The Jag commandos were coming. These weren't the small rubber dinghies used by scouts. These were flat-bottomed assault boats powered by heavy motors, capable of carrying a squad of men and heavy weapons. They moved with a confident aggression. They weren't sneaking, they owned the river. They knew that the Soviet troops were terrified of the flamethrowers and the dogs. They expected the Russians to be hiding in the reeds or cowering in the mud on the banks. They didn't expect a man to be floating in the middle of the channel. The first boat rounded the bend. It was a gray, ugly craft, bristling with guns. A heavy machine gun was mounted on the bow, manned by a gunner who scanned the tree line with bored intensity. Behind him stood the Jag commando officer. He looked exactly like the rumors described. He wore a tailored uniform, not the ragged fatigues of the front line. He held a pair of Zeiss binoculars to his eyes, scanning the riverbanks with the slow, methodical sweep of a predator. He wasn't looking at the water. Why would he? The water was empty. He was looking at the reeds. He was looking for the telltale shape of a helmet, or the glint of a rifle barrel, or the unnatural straight line of a trench. He was looking for the mistake that every terrified soldier makes. Okhlopkov watched the boat through the tiny gap in the weeds draped over his scope. He was less than 50 yards away from the boat, floating in the open. If the officer lowered his binoculars and looked down, he would see a log. If he looked closer, he might see the top of a head covered in mud, but the officer didn't look down. He looked up. He looked at the ridge. He saw the slight discoloration of the earth where the Soviet soldiers had dug their foxholes. He saw the way the bushes didn't quite match the surrounding vegetation. He saw the trap. The officer lowered his binoculars and pointed toward the ridge. He shouted an order to the gunner. He didn't even bother to take cover. He was so confident in his assessment that he simply lit a cigarette and waited for the show to start. The German heavy machine gun swung toward the ridge. The gunner pulled the charging handle. On the ridge, the Soviet platoon froze. They realized too late that they had been spotted. They were 300 yards away, well within range of the German guns, but completely exposed to the heavy caliber fire that was about to rain down on them. They had built a fortress on the only target in the swamp. They held their breath, waiting for the slaughter. They didn't fire. They knew that if they opened up now, they would give away their exact positions to the other boats coming up behind the lead craft. They were paralyzed by the realization that their political officer had been wrong. The dry ground wasn't safety, it was the kill zone. Okhlopkov drifted. The current pushed him gently toward the center of the river, closing the distance to the German boat. He was now 40 yards away, 30 yards. He could see the officer's face clearly. He could see the smoke curling from the cigarette. He could see the arrogant tilt of the man's jaw. The officer was ignoring the river completely. To him, the water was just a road. It was a flat, empty surface that carried him to his prey. He didn't respect the water. He didn't fear it. That was his mistake. He thought he was the hunter, but he had walked into the living room of a man who had been hunting since he could walk. The cold had worked its way deep into Okhlopkov's core. His fingers were stiff, white claws gripping the stock of the rifle underwater. His legs were numb logs trailing behind him. He couldn't feel his toes, but his heart was slow. His breathing was invisible. He was entering the state that the Yakut hunters called the quiet place. It was a mental space where pain didn't exist, where time stopped, where there was only the target and the weapon. He didn't think about the cold. He didn't think about the war. He thought about the shot. He had to fire just as the boat bobbed on a small wave. He had to time the rise and fall of his own body in the water with the movement of the target. It was a complex calculus of fluid dynamics and ballistics, performed by a man whose brain was slowly freezing to death. The German officer raised his hand to signal the other boats. He was going to order a coordinated attack on the ridge. He was going to burn the Soviet platoon out of their holes. He opened his mouth to shout the command. Okhlopkov's finger tightened on the trigger. The water around the muzzle of the rifle rippled slightly as he adjusted his aim. The scope crosshairs settled on the buttons of the officer's tunic. It was a center mass shot, a kill shot. The officer was still looking at the ridge, his eyes fixed on the terrified men in the foxholes. He never looked down. He never saw the log drift into position. He never saw the eye of the hunter staring at him from the surface of the swamp. The tension in the air was physical. On the ridge, the Soviet soldiers were gripping their weapons, praying for a miracle. On the boat, the German gunner was tensing his muscles, ready to unleash a stream of lead. In the water, Okhlopkov was a statue. He exhaled slowly, letting the air bubble out of his nose underwater. The bubbles broke the surface and popped, tiny sounds lost in the drone of the boat engines. He waited for the boat to steady. He waited for the officer to stop moving. He waited for the perfect second, and then the officer laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of laughter, a sound of pure contempt for the enemy he was about to destroy. He thought he was the master of the swamp. That laughter was the signal. Okhlopkov squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell. The firing pin struck the primer. The powder inside the cartridge ignited. The bullet left the barrel, tearing through the thin layer of water covering the muzzle, and flew toward the man who had underestimated the river. The silence of the swamp was about to be broken by a sound that no one on that boat was expecting, the sound of death coming from the empty water. The bullet from Okhlopkov's Masin-Nagant did not sound like a gunshot to the men on the boat. Because the muzzle was only an inch above the waterline, the blast was swallowed by the swamp. It sounded more like a heavy, dull thud, a noise that was felt in the chest rather than heard by the ears. But the effect was instantaneous. The German officer, who a split second ago had been laughing at the empty ridge, was suddenly thrown backward as if he had been kicked by a horse. The round caught him in the center of his chest, punching through the tailored fabric of his tunic and shattering his sternum. He didn't cry out. He didn't give an order. He simply folded in half and toppled over the side of the low gunwale, splashing into the murky water of the Pripet River. The cigarette he had been smoking hissed as it hit the surface, leaving a tiny trail of gray smoke that marked the spot where the commander of the patrol used to be. For 3 seconds, the German soldiers on the boat did nothing. Their brains could not process what had just happened. They were the hunters. They were the ones with the machine guns and the flamethrowers. They were the ones who owned the river. The idea that their leader could be dead before the battle even started was impossible. They stared at the ripples spreading out from where the officer had fallen. They stared at the empty air where he had been standing. Then, the gunner on the bow reacted. He did exactly what Okhlopkov knew he would do. He didn't look at the water. He didn't scan the river for a floating log. He looked at the only place his mind could accept as a threat. He looked at the ridge. The gunner screamed a warning and swung the heavy machine gun toward the Soviet positions on the dry ground. He clamped his hands onto the spade grips and unleashed a torrent of fire. The heavy caliber bullets tore into the dirt of the ridge, shredding the bushes and kicking up geysers of dry earth. The other soldiers on the boat joined in instantly. They raised their rifles and submachine guns, pouring fire into the empty foxholes 300 yards away. They were shooting at ghosts. They were shooting at the phantom army that their officer had pointed out to them moments before. They were convinced that the shot had come from the high ground because in their experience, death always came from the high ground. Okhlopkov was floating less than 40 yards away from this eruption of violence. The noise was physically painful. The heavy machine gun was hammering away so close to him that he could feel the shockwaves vibrating through the water against his chest. The empty brass casings from the German guns were flying out of the ejection ports and splashing into the river, some of them landing just a few feet from his head. He watched the brass sink, spinning down into the darkness of the bog. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He kept his chin resting on the wet wood of the log, his body limp in the water. He knew that if he kicked his legs or tried to swim away now, the movement would catch the gunner's eye. He had to be driftwood. He had to trust the current to carry him away from the kill zone. The other German boats roared up the river, drawn by the sound of the shooting. There were 3 of them now, forming a line of battle. They saw the lead boat firing at the ridge and assumed the attack was on. They added their own weapons to the chorus. The air was filled with the roar of engines and the tearing sound of machine guns. Then came the flamethrowers. The assault boats moved closer to the bank, and the specialists unleashed their liquid fire. Long, arcing streams of burning fuel shot toward the ridge, coating the trees and the grass in sticky, orange flame. The heat was intense, rolling across the water in waves. Okhlopkov could feel the warmth on his face, a strange and terrifying contrast to the freezing water that was numbing his legs. The ridge was being systematically destroyed. The trees were burning. The sandbags the Soviet soldiers had placed were being ripped apart. The ground was being churned into a moonscape. It was a display of overwhelming firepower, a sledgehammer blow designed to crush the Soviet platoon. But there was nobody home. The Soviet soldiers, terrified but disciplined, were huddled in the bottom of their holes on the far side of the ridge, or had already slipped away into the deeper swamp, as per Okhlopkov's earlier advice. The Germans were fighting a war against dirt and wood. They were expending thousands of rounds of ammunition and hundreds of gallons of fuel to kill a piece of ground. And while they focused all their rage and attention on that ridge, a small, moss-covered log drifted slowly past their boats, carried by the lazy current of the river. Okhlopkov drifted inches from the lead boat's hull. He was close enough to see the rivets, close enough to hear the German boots stomping on the deck above his head. The soldiers were screaming at the flamethrower operators to burn higher, their eyes locked on the ridge, hypnotized by their own violence. They never looked down. The human eye chases motion, and the water was deathly still. As he passed the stern, the propeller's turbulence rocked him violently. Every instinct screamed to grab the log tight, but he forced his body to go limp. He had to be dead wood. If he fought the current, he died. If he swam, he died. He simply let the river take him, floating right through the heart of the German formation. If he swam, he would create a wake. So he hung there, suspended in the freezing misery, watching the black smoke rise into the sky behind him. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It was a poison. It had worked its way past his skin and into his muscles. His fingers were locked onto the rifle stock, frozen in a claw-like grip that he couldn't release. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. He was losing the feeling in his legs. The danger now wasn't the Germans. It was the river itself. If he lost consciousness, he would slip off the log and sink. Back at the ambush site, the German fury was beginning to turn into confusion. The ridge was burning. They had pounded it for 10 solid minutes. Nothing could have survived that barrage, and yet there was no return fire, no screams, no bodies tumbling down the slope. The JAG commandos were elite troops. They knew what a battle felt like, and this felt wrong. It felt empty. The lead boat idled its engine and drifted toward the muddy bank. A squad of soldiers jumped out, their boots sinking into the muck. They moved up the slope with weapons raised, ready to finish off the survivors. They swept the ridge with professional efficiency. What they found stopped them in their tracks. They found the foxholes, yes. They found the fresh earth, but the holes were empty. There were no bodies. There were no blood trails. There were no discarded weapons. It was a ghost town. The German sergeant stood on the lip of a crater and looked around, bewildered. He kicked a sandbag. He looked at the burning trees. He realized with a sinking feeling that they had been tricked. They had unleashed hell on a decoy, and somewhere, out in the swamp, the person who had killed their officer was laughing at them. When the Germans finally pulled their officer from the reeds, the panic set in. His chest was destroyed by a single precision impact, a kill shot from nowhere. They scanned the water, eyes wide, looking for a boat, a swimmer, anything, but the river was empty. The log that had drifted past them was gone. The fear that rippled through the unit was colder than the water itself. They realized they weren't fighting an army, they were fighting the swamp. Okhlopkov was now a mile away, drifting around a bend in the river that finally put a wall of trees between him and the Germans. The sounds of the engines were fading. The shooting had stopped. He was alone again in the silence of the Pripet Marshes. The adrenaline that had kept his heart pumping was gone, leaving him with nothing but the cold. He tried to move his legs to kick toward the shore, but they wouldn't obey. They felt like blocks of wood attached to his hips. The hypothermia was setting in. His brain was getting foggy. He saw shapes in the trees that weren't there. He heard voices in the running water. He knew that this was the end stage. If he didn't get out of the water soon, his heart would simply stop. He summoned the last reserve of strength he had, a reserve built from a lifetime of surviving the Siberian winters. He didn't try to swim. He used his arms to paddle, clawing at the water with stiff, frozen hands. He steered the log toward a thick patch of reeds on the southern bank. It took him 20 minutes to cover 50 yards. Every movement was an agony of effort. He hit the mudbank with a soft thud. He tried to stand up, but his legs collapsed under him. He fell face forward into the black slime of the bank. He lay there for a moment, the smell of rotting vegetation filling his nose, the mud coating his face. He was out of the river. He was alive. He dragged himself up the bank, crawling on his elbows like a wounded seal. He pulled his rifle with him, refusing to let go of the weapon that had saved his life. He reached the dry ground under the trees and rolled onto his back. He lay there, shivering violently, his body shaking so hard his teeth rattled in his skull. He stripped off his soaked tunic, wringing the water out with clumsy hands. He didn't have a fire. He didn't have a blanket. He had to generate heat by sheer will. He did jumping jacks in the mud. He rubbed his skin until it was raw. He forced the blood to flow back into his extremities. It took him an hour to get warm enough to walk. He checked his rifle. The action was wet, but the bore was clean. He checked his scope. It was still zeroed. He looked back upriver toward the column of smoke rising from the ridge. He imagined the Germans standing there, looking at the empty holes, looking at their dead officer, looking at the water. He didn't smile. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt the grim satisfaction of a professional who had completed a job. He had turned their strength against them. He had used their arrogance to blind them. And he had proven that in the Pripet Marshes, the most dangerous thing wasn't the man with the flamethrower. It was the man who could be a log. He began the long trek back to his own lines. He moved through the woods, silent and unseen, a ghost returning from the underworld. He had a report to file. He had to tell the political officer that the German inspection was canceled, and he had to tell him that the turtle had won. The legend of the water sniper was about to be born, not in a classroom or a training manual, but in the freezing mud of a river that had tried to kill him and failed. Okhlopkov shouldered his rifle and melted into the trees, leaving the river to its secrets and its dead. The walk back to the Soviet lines was not a victory lap, it was a resurrection. Fyodor Okhlopkov moved through the twilight of the Pripet Marshes like a creature that had crawled out of a primordial swamp. He was covered from head to boot in a layer of black, drying mud that cracked every time he moved a joint. His uniform was stiff with slime, smelling of rot and stagnant water. He didn't look like a soldier of the Red Army. He looked like a golem made of earth. Every step was a battle against the exhaustion that was trying to pull him down into the dirt. The adrenaline of the shot had long since faded, leaving behind only the deep, aching cold that had settled into his marrow. But he didn't stop. He navigated the maze of reeds and bogs by instinct, reading the subtle signs of the terrain that no map could show. He avoided the German patrols that were still frantically searching the riverbanks, slipping past them like a shadow. He wasn't thinking about medals or glory. He was thinking about a fire. He was thinking about dry socks. He was thinking about the fact that he was still alive when the universe had tried very hard to kill him. When he finally stumbled into the Soviet camp, the sentries almost shot him. They saw a dark, shambling shape emerging from the mist and raised their weapons, terrified that the swamp itself was attacking them. Okhlopkov raised a heavy hand, signaling them to hold fire. He walked past them without a word, his eyes fixed on the command dugout. The camp was in a state of nervous agitation. The men had heard the massive firefight downriver. They had seen the smoke rising from the ridge where they were supposed to be. They knew that something catastrophic had happened, but they didn't know who had won. They watched the Siberian sniper pass, their eyes wide. They saw the mud caked on his rifle. They saw the blue tint of his lips. They realized that while they had been sitting in the relative safety of the rear, this man had been swimming in hell. The political officer was sitting by a field radio, trying to get a report from headquarters, when Okhlopkov entered the dugout. The officer looked up and froze. He had written Okhlopkov off hours ago. In his mind, the Yakut was already a casualty, a foolish peasant who had drowned trying to prove a point. But here he was, dripping dirty water onto the floorboards, looking at the officer with eyes that were ancient and hard. Okhlopkov didn't salute. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. He simply reported that the German inspection team had been neutralized. He stated that the officer was dead and the patrol boats had retreated. Then, he asked for a cigarette. The officer didn't believe him at first. It seemed impossible. How could one man, floating in a river, take out a high-ranking commander surrounded by bodyguards? But the confirmation came swiftly. A scout team that had been observing the river from a safe distance returned with the news. They reported that the German patrol had panicked. They confirmed that the officer had fallen overboard after a single shot from nowhere. And most importantly, they reported the destruction of the dry ridge. They described how the German gunboats had pulverized the empty foxholes with machine guns and flamethrowers. The political officer went pale. He realized with a sickening jolt that if Okhlopkov hadn't argued with him, if the platoon had followed his orders and dug in on that ridge, they would all be dead. The fortress he had chosen was a smoking crater. The suicide mission in the water was the only reason any of them were still breathing. The vindication of Fyodor Okhlopkov was absolute. The laughter stopped. The jokes about him being a turtle or a log vanished instantly. The men in the platoon looked at him with a new kind of reverence. He wasn't just the weird hunter from the north anymore. He was the man who saw things they couldn't see. He was the man who could turn the landscape into a weapon. They started to imitate him. They stopped relying on the manual and started asking him how to camouflage their positions. They asked him how to move without sound. They asked him how to breathe. Okhlopkov taught them what he could, but some things cannot be taught. You cannot teach a man to lay in freezing water for 6 hours without moving. You cannot teach a man to slow his heart rate until he is barely alive. That kind of discipline is forged in the ice of Siberia, and it belongs to a different breed of human being. Okhlopkov didn't stop at the Pripet Marshes. The war moved west, grinding toward Germany, and Okhlopkov moved with it. He became a myth on the Eastern Front. The Germans knew his name. They called him the Yakut. They put a bounty on his head. They sent their own best snipers to hunt him down, men trained in the best schools in Berlin. They all failed. Okhlopkov killed them in duel after duel. He didn't beat them because he had a better rifle. He beat them because he had more patience. He treated the war like a job. He didn't kill for sport or for hatred. He killed because it was necessary. He kept a tally, not for bragging rights but for accuracy. By the end of the war, his official count stood at 429 confirmed kills. That is not a typo. 429 soldiers. That is the equivalent of an entire battalion of men removed from the battlefield by a single trigger finger. But the swamp eventually took its toll. By the time the Red Army reached Berlin, Okhlopkov had been wounded 12 times, shot, blown up by mines, and buried by artillery. He was a wrecked man, his body a map of scars and his hands shaking from nerve damage. Yet he never took a desk job. He returned to Yakutia not as a superhero, but as a quiet commercial hunter who just wanted to fade back into the forest. He returned to his village in Yakutia, expecting nothing. He didn't ask for parades. He didn't ask for a pension. He simply put his rifle away and went back to work. He became a commercial hunter again, trapping fur and managing the local wildlife. He married, had children, and lived a quiet life in a wooden house on the edge of the forest. For decades, the Soviet government largely ignored him. The title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor in the land, was denied to him for years, caught up in bureaucracy and the politics of the time. It wasn't until 1965, 20 years after the victory, that the medal was finally pinned to his chest. By then, he was an old man. He accepted it with the same stoic expression he had worn in the swamp. He didn't need a piece of gold to tell him what he had done. He knew. Fyodor Okhlopkov died in 1968. He passed away quietly, surrounded by his family, thousands of miles away from the mud and the blood of the Pripet Marshes. Today, there is a cargo ship named after him. There are streets in Yakutia that bear his name, but the real monument to his life isn't made of concrete or steel. It is the story itself. It is the memory of a man who looked at the impossible machinery of modern war, the tanks, the planes, the flamethrowers, and defeated it with a piece of driftwood. He proved that no matter how much technology you have, You cannot beat a man who is willing to become part of the earth. He proved that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a machine gun, it is the human will to endure. We rescue these stories because we are in danger of forgetting them. We live in an age of button-pushing warfare, of drones and satellites. It is easy to think that war is a video game, detached and clean, but the story of Okhlopkov reminds us that at its core, conflict is about mud and cold and fear. It reminds us that the people who win are the ones who can suffer the most without breaking. It reminds us that ingenuity is often just another word for desperation. Okhlopkov didn't hide in the water because it was clever. He did it because it was the only way to survive. He embraced the misery because the misery was his armor. If you believe that the story of the water sniper deserves to be remembered, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that we care about the men who fought in the shadows. It helps us find more stories of the soldiers who used their brains to defeat an army. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing out on the best history class you never took. We are searching every day for the legends that time forgot. Leave a comment below and tell us, what is the most extreme example of survival you have ever heard of? Could you have lasted 12 hours in that water? We read every single comment. We want to hear your thoughts. The Pripet Marshes are quiet now, the scars of the war healed by the moss in the trees, but the lesson remains. Never underestimate a log drifting in the current. Thanks for watching.